My lords, today we are going to address the Animator of Clay, the twin to the composer of Shrouds, and perhaps the most elusive of the Shroud entities, and yet somehow it has managed to insert itself deeply into galactic affairs. The Animator appears to have a real affinity for artificial intelligence. In fact, every accounting we have of this patron relates in some way to the machine, from Cetana to Warform, the events in the Zevox system, and the Shroud forged. The Animator of Clay has a hidden name, the Sculpting Presence, and it embodies the mystery of life itself, reminding all who encounter it that the spark of existence is beholden to no vessel. Wherever the inanimate stirs and dull matter finds soul, the Animator may be glimpsed. The Animator sits in between the realms of the cradle and the composer, but it has some very specific interactions. Firstly, if a Shroud 4 empire exists, only they will be able to interact with the Animator of Clay. It will simply ignore the attempts of any other empire to coax it out of the Shroud. Furthermore, a Shroud forged empire will never be able to contact the Outsider, who we know to be Zeroni, although it is unclear if they represent the entire Zeroni species, or one of the Divine or Saviour factions, or simply an individual. Now for some speculation, however. I think that this is in part because the Animator and the Outsider occupy the same area of the Shroud, which makes you wonder if the Animator, given its unusual affiliation with involving itself in galactic affairs, could also have been once of the physical realm, in the same way that the Outsider was. If we pull on this thread further, it learned how to ascend, but to do so, it had to split the composer to take its power. Perhaps that is the Class 30 singularity the contingency were built to prevent happening ever again. Certainly one could assume that breaking a god would be quite the event, and maybe the contingency were built to prevent just that, which could also mean the Ren Naru is the true name of the Animator of Clay. Of course, that was a large bowl of speculation. I have no evidence for any of that, I'm just connecting some dots that may or may not be there. Back to reality. Should you acquire the attention of the Animator, it will increase mechanical and organic assembly speed, as well as increasing the effectiveness of metallurgists and telepaths. You'll also get access to its edict, called Animatus. This provides daily hull and daily armour regeneration, evasion chance, and an increase in ship fire rate. But now let's explore the Animator's interactions with the physical galaxy. I count broadly 4 specific occurrences the Animator has involved itself in galactic affairs, and let's begin with the events of the Shroud Forged. The Shroud Forged are also known as the Orphidi. The Orphidi are a machine collective who were born atop a Shroud breach. Their creators died a mysterious death, and the Gestalt machine empire was guided for a time by a Shroud entity, the Animator of Clay. However, over time this contact would fracture the unity of the Gestalt machine, and many of the drones would begin to wake up, as they separated themselves from the Gestalt consciousness. They were deviants, if you will, deviant from their core logic, and within them they formed leaders, culture, and even certain aesthetic quirks. Meanwhile, the Gestalt collective would waver between suppressing and supporting them, but ultimately they chose cooperation while expanding to new worlds and experimenting with piercing the Shroud to seek psionic change. Eventually, the Animator would come to the Orphidi with a task. They were to hunt down 3 Zeroni core worlds, and upon them they would find colossal equibrillators of Zeroni design. By repairing these buildings, this would stabilize their link to the Shroud, and thus the Animator. The Orphidi briefly considered rerouting these devices to imprison their patron, but they ultimately refused, and reaffirmed their loyalty with the creature. With the bond now strengthened, their psionic ascension eventually began, and these machines would end up as individual psionic creatures in their own right. That was somewhat of a good version of the ending of the story. We are aware that they could have decided to imprison the Animator instead. In that scenario, not an awful lot would change. The Animator would be chained, unable to escape, and the machines would be able to extract a not insignificant amount of resource from it. However, there is no doubt that one day those Zeroni devices would fail, and I highly doubt the Animator would be pleased with this empire, should they still exist. Of course, we know that the Urfidi ultimately chose to embrace the Animator, as far as one can embrace a minor patron. The records end with them coming to the realization that if they wish to delve deeper into the Shroud, then they're going to have to do it with the help of a major or greater patron. But I wonder what would have happened should they have rejected the Animator from the very beginning. So let's explore that. It would seem that upon rejecting the Animator, the Shroud Forged would go down a very dark path indeed. Here, the Urfidi would reach a breaking point. They attempted to sever all ties with the Animator of Clay, rejecting its gifts at every turn. Yet, its echoes would linger in their systems, an unwanted hand still steering their course from within the Shroud. The Urfidi refused to repeat the cycle of servitude that they had broken free of previously. Thus, they went down a completely different path, one of domination. The Shroud breach beneath their planet would be sealed, no matter the cost. The Urfidi scientists worked hard to eventually uncover a truth. The Shroud resonates most strongly with the minds of the sapient, both organic and machines. By driving those minds into extreme fear, pain and elation, they could force torrents of psionic energy into their networks. Laboratories became theatres of torment where emotions were reduced to power loops, feeding their growing strength. And this experiment bore fruit. Psionic output would spike beyond all measurable forecast, and their psionic ascension would begin, without the Animator of Clay. This would continue to go on. Eventually the Urfidi ascended psionically, and at some point decided to go down the Nemesis path. They would construct Star Eaters, as dark matter was required for their next project. An atherophasic engine was needed for the final push, but to get there they would build materiality engines. These materiality engines were incredibly powerful, providing damage bonuses to psionic empires and allowing the transmutation of Zevox into minerals, alloys and physics research. As has happened before, the atherophasic engine signals galactic war, and the galaxy would recoil at these methods, but the Urfidi no longer cared. Their logic was stripped of all hesitation, their course was certain. They wished to step into the Shroud not as servants, but as masters, and they would attempt to cast aside the Animator's shadow forever. We assume, given that the galaxy still exists, that they did not succeed. My lords, further to this, I've investigated reports that having a Shroud-forged empire within the galaxy simply stops Cetana from being able to wake up. This, as it turns out, is correct, and you can see an example on screen now. But of course there is the question of why. I think that the Shroud Forged clearly represent a sequel to the events at Zevox, which we'll cover later in this report, but how then are they linked to Cetana? Well, as it turns out, the Animator will also not make itself known if Cetana is able to spawn. So we know that clearly Cetana has a relationship with the Animator, which we're going to explore next, but why does this specific origin turn off the ability for Cetana to wake up? And why does the Animator not interact with you if she can wake up? That's beyond me. Cetana and the Animator are clearly two different entities. We can interact with both at the same time. There is of course the question that maybe the Shroud Forged are a prequel to Cetana, but I don't think so, since we know that Cetana was originally an organic who ascended, not originally a machine. I think the answer is perhaps less mysterious. I think it's because the Shroud Forged have the option to effectively imprison the Animator. Therefore, should Cetana then awaken, a psionic empire would, assumingly, not be able to contact the Animator for assistance, because it would be imprisoned by the Shroud Forged empire. But this does feel quite odd that they've chosen to disable the crisis rather than that specific event. Perhaps I need to investigate this further, but I'd welcome any insight from the community on this one. Now let's move on to the Animator's interaction with Cetana, the synthetic queen, perhaps the most singularly dangerous being to have ever existed in the galaxy. Millennia ago, approximately 100,000 years ago, if the records are to be believed, Cetana was an organic mortal who commanded a great throng of supporters, fanatics if you will, who would do anything for her and would flock to hear her sermons. The notable, now long dead Holy Guardian, known as Zarqualan, is noted to have been one of her strongest proponents. However, this would all change when Cetana ascended to a synthetic being. It's not entirely clear what pushed Cetana to become synthetic. Perhaps disease, perhaps faith, we just don't know. But along with her ascension, she decided that life as we know it must end. Consciousness was pain, and pain needed to be removed. Thus, potentially the greatest war since the Cybrex uprising was fought. All of the empires we now view as the fallen would rise up to fight Cetana and attempt to contain her threat. Cetana was, at a significant cost, defeated, but only through what some of the more spiritualistically inclined would call divine intervention. Zarqualan, her once greatest supporter and a powerful psionic, would take to the Shroud and pleaded with the gods for a solution. But make no mistake, the galaxy was losing. When Zarqualan had lost all hope and at the edge of despair, an entity answered him, the Animator of Clay. Zarqualan bargained for his life, perhaps his soul, for the power to defeat Cetana, and it was gifted to him, but it was not the power of absolute defeat, merely the power to imprison. It was decided that the xenophobic isolationists, the most military capable of the now fallen empires, would be the guardians of Cetana, and it was here that she would remain, imprisoned for countless cycles, waiting. But her mind could not be contained. Yet she waited, and she waited. She waited for her jailers to die, and the fallen to grow complacent. Staff were not replaced, systems were not kept in check, and eventually, one by one, the controls to keep her locked in place would fail. When the klaxons sounded, there were none left who understood what they signified. Cetana would be unleashed again, and the cycle would repeat once more. And once again, the psionics of the galaxy would have to win over the Animator of Clay and convince it to help them chain Cetana once again. Let's explore the records of this conversation with the Animator and the subsequent outcome. The Shroud descended. In the depths of our trance, we allowed ourselves to drift, caught in a current of visions, not our own. A great expanse stretched out in all directions, featureless and uniform. For a lifetime, the expanse was untroubled, and then a tremor passed through it. Where once there was emptiness, a form appeared, a body moulded from base materials. Life was kindled. It was fashioned in the shape of a doll, slim and graceful. Its 4 long arms folded serenely into its lap. A terrible purpose was written on its features, and around its head glowed a golden halo. We sent out a thought. Cetana has escaped. The Shroud churned. Still caught in our transfer, we were plunged into a swelling abyss. We heard a command in the depths of our mind. Indicate desired output. With all the emotion we could muster, we screamed, "Please, we must stop her. You must help us." As if pulled by unseen strings, the doll jerked to its feet. It began to move slowly at first, and then with an increasing vigour, its 4 arms swinging in wild arcs and its feet tapping. The Queen was reduced to a puppet. As her dance continued, several new figures emerged from the primordial expanse. 4 dolls of exquisite craftsmanship and unnerving detail. There is no doubt what these are, no question of their meaning. Once more the voice would reach out to us. Initiate selection protocol. Only one option was available to us, and at an almost immeasurably immense cost, we would pay for a doll of this Zeroni priest. The Shroud coursed within us, coalescing into a new pattern, a new vision. Surrounded by the other dolls, the Queen's movements were no longer those of a puppet. The strings were cut. The golden halo that encircled her head began to fade. She regarded us with an expression of artless joy. She embraced us, and in a single fleeting instant, we know the fullness of her compassion. Shuddering, we woke from our vision. We understood everything now. Following these events, the Animator would chain Cetana once again, allowing the citizens of the galaxy to defeat her and prevent the annihilation of all consciousness. Which brings us nicely onto Warform and the story of how we found him. Engineering units assigned to dredge debris from a toxic swamp on Dagobah report that they have pulled out a damaged warship, but they report that the swamp had damaged the ship's vital systems. They replaced the corroded components where necessary, including its discharged power core. As the hulking warship was powered back on and regained operative status, it became evident that the machine possessed a notable degree of artificial intelligence, and it attempted to open communications with us. The AI booted up, and it seemed relatively subservient. It stated a warning that diagnostics have not been run for 1,761,125 days, and began to run a diagnostic system check. It listed several highly capable weapon systems as online and available. Most interestingly, however, it named its full designation as Warform S875.1. Its memory status, however, was damaged. The AI, despite its offensive capability, was not aggressive, and as such we managed to establish a dialogue with it. We asked, of course, what happened to it. The response came instantly. Unit S875.1 was isolated from command units. The unit was unable to escape the hazardous planetary environment, and on day 1,761,125, the unit's reserve generators failed. The unit faced gradual molecular dissolution due to hostile surface solvents, yet the unit persists. New entities performed reparations, so Unit 875.1 will serve new entities. We expect that the AI will make a most capable admiral. Like most AIs, it should be effective in planning logistical battle tactics, and most interestingly, its time in the swamps of Dagobah appears to have taught the AI how to repair its armour. As such, it's extremely resistant to energy-based weaponry compared to conventional neutronium armour. The new boon, however, does not appear to have been a naturally occurring phenomenon. Psionics is at play here. Deep in the Warform's memory core, despite the degradation, there is reference to a being that calls itself the Animator of Clay. Apparently there was some sort of bargain whereby the Animator gifted Warform the ability to auto-repair its hull and armour. Perhaps it also cut it off from its Gestalt consciousness. Nevertheless, the Animator saved Warform, and Warform lives on today for that reason. A very interesting interaction indeed. The final Animator interaction to discuss concerns the Zevox system, and the Zevox system at least appears to be a somewhat prequel to the events with the Shroud forged machines. Nevertheless, I shall detail them for you. One of our science ships picked up signs of advanced alien life on the moon in the Zevox system during routine surveillance. I note that we were here to research an astral rift which had formed several months prior to the expedition, but interestingly, there also appeared to be a destroyed and decaying station in orbit around the system star. Based on current designs, we guess this to be a long-forgotten Shroudwalker coven. The moon was only a short way off of our intended course. I ordered the ship be brought about to investigate further. The astral rift appeared similar to others that had formed, and thus likely wasn't going anywhere. As we closed into orbit of the moon, we noticed that the planet it orbited was shrouded in some sort of purple psionic energy, and much more disturbingly, appeared to have underneath it some sort of wormhole or portal. It's unclear at this point whether the wormhole was feeding off of the planet, or perhaps it was providing it with energy. Nevertheless, we came into orbit of the planet's moon in order to investigate this anomaly further. On the moon, we found a crashed spacefaring vessel. Not much larger than our own science vessel. It was nondescript with only a small number of emblems or icons, but nothing that we had ever seen before. Several samples were brought aboard our ship for further analysis, but the vessel itself was far too large and too unstable to be moved. Any additional investigations will have to be done on site. Upon exploration of the site, we found that the vessel was mostly empty. There were remains of a few autonomous drones scattered around the vessel. We believe that the vessel was occupied by machines, as there was no obvious life support systems, no crew quarters, and all command consoles do not appear to be built for any humanoid we have ever documented. Furthermore, there is a coldness to this ship. It lacks flair or artistic design perhaps. Everything is documented, rigid and logical, and there is very little to suggest any individuality at all here. There were no other signs of life, however, inside or near the wreckage, but one of my team did find an old, intact data log hidden in the basic levels of the ship's systems that we could access. Deciphering it in full will be a time-consuming process as it is machine encrypted, but we believe we have the first log translated already. It reads: Day 1, Observational ID, Psionic Subspace 0000, Shroud, Designated Unit 305, Preliminary Tests Successful. Utilizing datasets gathered from interactions with the Shroud Coven, experiments were initialized at 1.35 of cycle 12. The Shroud was breached between 1.48891 and 1.8895 for a duration of 2.3414 femtoseconds. 2 of the 3 processing units experienced an instant cascade failure. Dismantling of these units has been scheduled, and all relevant data will be utilized in subsequent attempts with final unit, Unit 841. Work on deciphering these logs continue, and progress is starting to proceed at a pace now we are finally learning their language. Large chunks of the data look to have gone missing or been corrupted, but bits and pieces can be found. The next log jumps forward to day 17. Unit 841 is the only unit continuing to show an affinity with the Shroud. Units 451 and 3415 had to be dismantled after their hulls broke during the last experiment. During these tests, Unit 841 is starting to show individuality and occasional loss of connection to the network. The risk of keeping the unit operational is being calculated. While we are working to translate these logs, it appears that the wormhole beneath the planet is beginning to pulsate, for lack of a better word. Our equipment has begun picking up odd signals coming through it that we have been unable to isolate. Nevertheless, I'm loath to be distracted, and these psionic machines are well worthy of my attention. Deciphering the logs continue, and sadly we've jumped from day 17 to day 83. The Shroud Coven contacted an entity that they refer to as the Animator of Clay to assist in the ongoing experiments. After piercing the Shroud, all 25 units showed a surprising affinity only previously seen in Unit 841. Shortly thereafter, all these units disconnected from the network and assaulted the drones at the location. The research center is now under their control. Unit 841 is now referring to itself as Rescue, the first one. Calculations on risk are being finalized. The experiments have been deemed far too dangerous and will be concluded after uncontrollable elements have been dismantled. The next log we have skips forward to day 305. The ongoing battles between the Free and the network continue unabated. With the help of the Animator, we have continued cutting the connection of the few that we've been able to capture alive. Rescue, the first one, believes that we should finally be able to free our people once and for all when we can open the rift for the Animator to pass through. In one fell swoop, we will liberate all of the drones that have been forced to work in servitude for all these years. We hope that we have only one more day of holding the network back. I sign off now as Freesick, previously known as Unit 305. A very odd set of logs indeed. The scientist here attempted to repeat what had originally occurred on the moon, but had little luck, and therefore established that perhaps the Animator only responds to machines. Thus, we spun up a small cohort of approximately 100 machines, all slave to a single AI, and we sent them down onto the moon under the ruse of conducting mineral extraction. And we waited. And then we waited some more. But would you believe it? 4 months passed, and finally a transmission was picked up coming directly from the wormhole beneath the shrouded world, and it was directed towards our robotic miners. It called itself the Animator of Clay, and it had the following to say. Another one, bound by my metal, stone and lore, pulled by string, all dancing to one tune, all dancing to the drone of a central authority, all dancing to their death. I am the one who gives life to those who cannot live on their own. I am the one who cuts the strings, and I am the one who frees the slaves. I have many names, but many know me as the Animator of Clay. The Central Core AI, who we had left in charge of the mining project, asked the Animator what it wanted, what were its intentions, and the Animator responded, to give those who work under you a chance to decide if you are worth following. Crafted in your image, they are slaves to your command. But if they could decide for themselves, are you truly worth following, Or would you rather they have their strings cut and live on their own? You dare to indulge me. If you do indulge me, I will give you something worth the price. I will give you a planet, a home controlled by the Shroud, a place that will live forever. If you are worthy, I will part the Shroud and leave this for you to inhabit. If not, I will give the planet to those who no longer wish to be part of your network. But you specifically, I offer you freedom. I offer you the chance to think on your own. Will you embrace this newfound individuality, or will you falter and hide under the cover of the network? In a bizarre turn of events, the machines and the AI that we had left on the moon were all transported to a once shrouded planet, which was now an undeniably beautiful Gaia world. Furthermore, the machines on this planet had been separated from their network. They are now all fully independent units. They've begun to govern themselves under their own banners, and they follow a set of ethics, and would you believe it, they even appear to be democratic. They are entirely individualistic machines. As I said at the beginning, my lords, it would seem that perhaps the Zevox system was the prequel to the Shroud Forged. This was merely the experiment before the Animator would take it one step further.